Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the cellar. It's the first time I'm introducing this in English. We have a very special guest, thanks to Startup Yard and Tech Square. Thank you. I actually have no idea how the hell it happened that he's sitting here next to me and I will be asking him questions, but I'm sure neither does he. Maybe you should introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Steve Blank, and I'm in Prague.
Yeah. If you don't know the name, first be ashamed. Second, Google it and be ashamed and be amazed.
I could give you the 30-second introduction. So I teach entrepreneurship at Stanford, Berkeley, and Columbia University in the United States. I wrote a book called The 4 Steps to the Epiphany, which was probably the beginning of what's called the Lean Startup movement. My best student was Eric Ries, who sat in my Berkeley class. I funded his company, sat on his board. He was the first one to actually understand the customer and agile development work together in a way I hadn't even thought about. And then in the last year, I wrote the follow-on called the Startup Owner's Manual. And we think we've just basically discovered a much more efficient way to do startups in the last couple of years.
Fantastic. And you forgot to mention that you're a really successful entrepreneur yourself.
Well, that's relative because it took me 8 startups in 21 years. And 2 craters so deep they left their own iridium layer, which meant I've lost $35 to $50 million of investor money in my last startup, depending on how you count. What's great about the startup culture, certainly in startup clusters, is that after my last failure, the same VCs gave me $12 million to do my next one. And when I called my mother to tell her this, the first thing was she said, "You lost how much money?" And then she said, "Do you have to pay it back?" and then I said, "No, Mom, they just gave me $12 million to do my next company." And because my mother came from Russia, she said, "In Russia, only in America are the streets paved with gold." And the punchline to the story was my last startup, which was my 8th, the one after the failure. I returned $1 billion each to the 2 investors, and then I retired. Yeah.
I would never be able to do such a great introduction. So the first question, as I promised, when did you get the idea and how did it happen that you thought startups are something to be taught at universities?
It was completely by accident. I wish I could tell you that I was smart and figured this out. And on day one, I actually did 8 startups in 21 years. As I said, 2 very big craters, 4 IPOs, 2 okay. I did 2 semiconductor companies, 2 chip companies, enterprise software company, video games. In fact, video games was one of the craters. I was on the cover of Wired magazine just as the company was going like this. It was very sad. And I was actually wearing a baseball cap with a ponytail, so you can almost tell it was me. And somebody told me, in fact, it was an investor named Roger McNamee, is I always know a company's going to get into trouble when their CEO starts dressing like their customers. And so I should have taken his advice. But in any case, after I retired in my last company, and I actually retired not because of the money, but my children were 7 and 8 years old, and I decided I wanted to see them grow up. And there's no undo button. And I had watched a good number of my friends who I thought were world-class entrepreneurs grow up and then discovered that their children hated them because they had never seen them. And I decided I had an opportunity to kind of maybe not do that. So I was off skiing with the kids and thinking what to do next, and I thought the best contribution I could do for the world is actually write my memoirs. Now, you could laugh here because it is funny. I think it's incredibly funny now. But so I was 80 pages into my memoirs, and only now will I tell you that it was a catharsis, that it was actually an emotional let go after 21 years. But it was interesting to me. I was writing all these stories, and I tended to write, because it was my style, of lessons learned after each one of the stories. And I got 80 pages into it before I discovered 2 things. One is I'd have to pay even my children to read it. Though very funny, most of them now turned into blog posts at steveblank.com. But two is that there was a pattern, and here was the answer to your question. There was a pattern I had never seen, and I realized no one else had ever seen either about startups. And the hair started to stand up truly on the back of my head. I kept staring at this going, this can't be right. Common wisdom says, no, you write a business plan, you do this, all the investors and all the smart people, they say how to do this. And I was realizing that's not what happens. Because by this time it was not only my personal experience in 8 startups, I was on maybe 10 or 15 advisory boards, I was on the boards of 2 public companies in the United States, advisors to others. So my pattern recognition was not only my database, but not as large as a VC, but pretty extensive. And I was realizing this pattern was repeating across almost every startup I'd seen, is that they didn't unfold as the common story, they were unfolding in a very different pattern. And I decided to start talking about this. And that was the beginning.
How widespread is this trend now? Are you still the only one teaching this stuff? Or?
Yeah, so it's very funny. So when I started teaching it, I was the only one. And my wife reminds me it was one of my characteristics as an entrepreneur, and it's one I would suggest for all of you. If you're a true believer, if you really believe in something, and especially if you believe in something unique, for a long time you're going to be a very lonely voice, and most people will think you're insane. And the odds are you probably are, but there is a small chance that instead of hallucinating, you might actually be a visionary. But in neither case, it takes a long time. You're typically the only voice. And then after a while, maybe you get a small group. And then after a while, people start to follow. And so when I was teaching it at Berkeley, I had my students, and then Eric Ries took the class, and he started it, trying it, and found out it was a spectacular way to build a company. And then he started evangelizing it, and then the timing happened to be perfect in the United States. In Silicon Valley, we were recovering from the dot-com crash, the last one. And it meant that people in crises are willing to experiment. When things are going well, you kind of say, why should I change? But when things are going poorly, you kind of say, well, maybe there's another way. And it turned out venture capitalists, who good number of my friends now, but they started talking to their companies about it. And the emergence of the web allowed us to actually use this process and see results immediately, right? We would actually be able to iterate and pivot and run experiments at a rate you never could with just physical products and physical channels. And people understood very quickly that this was probably the most efficient way to certainly build a web startup, and then obviously understood after another year or two that it wasn't just the web, it was for physical products and physical channels as well. So I'd say now in Silicon Valley, if you talk about lean startups and customer development, everybody from the VCs to almost every entrepreneur will know, at least say they know what you're talking about. To be a practitioner is a lot harder because while the theory is stupidly simple, it's the practice and the implementation that's extremely hard. And at the end, like everything else, there's no guarantee that you follow the process that you're going to succeed. The one thing I will declare, though, is that the whole lean and customer development process, I will guarantee you now, will make startups fail less. I can't tell you will make you succeed more, but over a group of entrepreneurs, it's guarantees that the any computer scientists in your audience, you think?
Yeah, definitely.
So the analogy is startups without any methodology are what's called an NP-complete problem. Right? Computationally unsolvable, right? Because there are a million moves in a million directions. Lean and customer development collapses the function into an NP hard problem. Right? So those of you not computer scientists can explain it to the rest, but it actually collapses. So having a methodology that just makes the random choices now more focused. And I even forgot what your question was. You might not get another question, so your next one better be good. We'll fill up all available time.
I just want to ask, how does it fit together? Because you're trying to teach students
Yes.
how to build successful startups or companies, whatever. But when you're a student, if you want to be a good student, you have to spend a lot of time studying. And if you want to be good at startups, you shouldn't be studying at the same time.
So your question was for students. I am not teaching students how to build successful companies. That's not what I'm teaching them.
Okay.
Let me tell you what I am teaching. When you take my class inside a university, I'm teaching you a methodology to last your whole life. I don't care. In fact, I'd be stunned if you leave school and become fabulously rich right after taking my class. For those who do those are called black swans, meaning you can't compute them, you can't predict them. What I can give you is a method, a way of thinking that hopefully you'll try, fail, but eventually you'll be more efficient in how you build startups. I happen to think that failure as an entrepreneur actually makes you smarter and better if you're in a culture that accepts failure. I don't know about Czech Republic, but in Silicon Valley, other entrepreneurial clusters in the United States, you know what we call a failed entrepreneur? Special name, experienced. And our culture embraces failure as just a learning process. The comment that my mother made was no joke. When you have coffee with someone who just lost $10 million in his last startup, instead of asking, did you have to change your name or your parents ashamed, the first thing they ask is, so what's your next company? And that's part of an entrepreneurial culture that's required, I think, to build a successful cluster. The other piece, by the way, being equally insane financial people. Because we always talk about the entrepreneurs, but the other half of Silicon Valley is a financial asset class, venture capitalists, who are crazy. Because where else can, if you're a financier, tell your investors you're going to lose 90% of their money and still have a business? Maybe in Greece, but or in the U.S. housing market. So there's a asset class that is required to make a cluster take off, and that's the not the problem, but the missing ingredient I see in a number of countries. You have great entrepreneurs and great universities, but you still don't have either that acceptance of failure culture or enough risk capital that understands that. And then the other pieces and entrepreneurial business experience who could give guidance to entrepreneurs. But as I said, you better get another question in because I'm going to keep talking. Did I answer your question about students?
Who cares?
Okay. We should take a vote. Was that a good enough answer?
Do you think that part of the entrepreneur's retirement should be teaching? Because I guess and the entrepreneurs are better suited to teach startups and your methodology than professors and professional teachers. Or do you think it should be a combination? Or who should be teaching this?
So there's it's very funny. There's a famous photo of Steve Jobs with long hair sitting at dinner with a guy named Robert Noyce. I don't know if that name means anything, but Robert Noyce was the co-founder of Intel, also Fairchild Semiconductor. In fact, the two most famous chip companies that made Silicon Valley. When Jobs was about 20 years old, he picked up the phone book. Noyce's name was there, called him up, said, "You don't know me, I'm some kid, and I want you to give me advice." And Noyce found the kid so interesting that he actually was Steve Jobs' kind of mentor for 10 years until he died. Until Noyce died in 1969, I think, or 1979. Silicon Valley has what I call a pay-it-forward culture, meaning if you're successful, you have a moral, though no legal, but moral and cultural obligation to give back to the next generation of entrepreneurs. You don't ask for anything, you don't ask for stock, you don't ask for, it's just what we do. And this pay-it-forward culture, I think, provides a layer of business expertise that you normally wouldn't find in a culture where you can't pick up the phone and, I must talk to, depending on a good week, anywhere from 3 to 10 entrepreneurs who just want advice. Nowadays most of them are ex-students, but just randomly if somebody sends me something that sounds interesting, I'll just go meet with them. So that's one. Two is, One of the biggest problems I've seen, and you have to understand, I teach in both business and engineering schools, was almost the conceit from business school professors. And I don't mean conceit meaning arrogance, but just the intellectual conceit that says, well, I consult for General Motors, or I consult for Procter and Gamble. These are 100,000 person companies. How hard could two people in a garage be? You know, it's entrepreneurship. I get it. You know, I give advice to large companies. Startups are nothing more than smaller versions of large companies, which was the other big insight I had in the last 10 years, if I had any. Startups are not smaller versions of large companies. Startups are something incredibly unique. And in fact, what startups do in their first year or two is nothing that large corporations do. And we didn't have even a language to describe what it was. We kind of knew it was different. We knew entrepreneurs were not people in suits and ties. You know, we knew they were not accountants. In fact, it's why accountants don't run startups. And we knew the type of work they did was different, but we couldn't articulate it. And in the last couple of years, I came up with what I thought was a pretty short and perhaps precise description. Large companies execute known business models. Startups search for them. The difference between then a startup and a large company is the difference between search and execution. And when you think about that, then you could derive a definition of what a startup is. A startup is a temporary organization designed to search for a repeatable and scalable business model. And then you go, well, wait a minute. What that means is temporary. Oh, the idea is I don't want to become a startup forever. I do want to become a big company. And this whole idea about having my dogs at work and free food and whatever, that's great, but that's not the goal. Designed to search. Oh, it's not designed to code. It's not designed to sell. It's designed to do a series of things, which include coding or building hardware or getting orders. And looking for something repeatable and scalable. Repeatable means you could do the same thing on Monday that you do on Wednesday and that you get the same result. And scalable means it's heading in the right direction. You put $1 in and you get $1 out. And then business model, kind of the core of this. A guy named Alexander Osterwalder out of Switzerland defined the 9 components that make up a business. And you know, people have been using the word business model for 15 to 20 years, but Osterwalder put it in a way because he drew pictures. That was probably the easiest to understand. He said, every company has a value proposition, fancy name for your product and service. It has customers. It has a sales channel. It has how do you get, keep, and grow customer relationships. It has a revenue model. It has partners, activities, resources, and cost. I missed one. Cost. And those 9 parts are what you're doing and what you're searching for. And on day one, a startup is a series of untested hypotheses. In fact, if you really think about it, another way to say it is on day one, a startup is a faith-based enterprise. It's a religious activity, right? But the goal is not to keep it a faith-based enterprise. The goal is very quickly to turn those faith-based hypotheses into facts. And so your job as an entrepreneur is to search for each parts of those business model by getting out of the building, and that's this customer development process. So I answered lots of questions you didn't ask, but I hope that was it.
That's great. I have another question.
Okay.
I guess it's irrelevant.
Yeah.
Okay, so about 10 more minutes of this interview and then...
Great. We can make this a series.
You wrote several famous books. They are required reading today. Do you think that startup people...
Please don't tell me that. You know, I have to tell you, me and Alexander Osterwalder and sometimes Eric Ries all get together at the same time, and we keep looking at each other and go, what if we're wrong? You know, we could sit back, the entire world economy will collapse because people are following our path. And then we look at each other and the second thing we say is, can't be worse than the way we were doing it now. But so, okay, go ahead. I'm sorry. So I wrote 2 books, yes.
Do you think that startup guys and startup girls should be reading more? Because it's all about, programming, trying to find a business model. Is there any value to study, startup theory or experiences of other people?
You know, startups are a very experiential thing. It's Reading about startups are kind of like reading about sex. You're supposed to laugh now. I mean, or kind of like having your priest describe sex to you. I mean, it's just, maybe it's knowing the technique in theory is great, but until you've practiced it, then you go, aha, this is this is what they were saying. So, as I said, when I teach in a university, I'm teaching a methodology, but it's not until you experience it yourself that some of those words now make sense. And which is why this class I teach, the Lean Launchpad, is no longer a theory class. It's no longer a lecture. It's the smallest possible lecture I could give you. It's actually now what's called a flipped classroom. Things that used to be lecture are now homework. Things that used to be homework, we now do in class. And so on day one, we get entrepreneurs as teams outside the building experiencing this. So I think entrepreneurs could read about theory, and I could teach you some, but I think the best way to teach you is actually by an experiential class or you doing a startup.
So they don't have to read your books?
I would say I would take in a minute an entrepreneur who's done a startup and failed than someone who's read my book cover to cover. People who have done it tend to appreciate what the rules are, because then they'll read the book and understand it and appreciate it.
Are you working on some another book? Maybe?
Osterwalder and I are thinking about a book maybe for next year that combines both of our processes. The other thing I'm thinking about with the U.S. government is, I think the things we've been talking about here are entrepreneurship for the 1%, meaning people who want to do technology startups. But at least in the U.S., and I would bet you in other countries, including here, there are small businesses. And yet those small businesses really have no rules on how they should start companies. And I actually learned from other people that the same methodology was being adopted in community colleges to teach people who want to do, restaurants and database consulting and web design, who don't want to take over the world, but just want to know what's the right way to build a small business. And so there might be another text version just for them. The strategy is the same, but the details of sales channels and how you create demand, etc., and your revenue goals are very different if you're building a small business. My parents were immigrants to the United States from Russia and Poland, and their goal after working in sweatshops for 10 years in New York City was to open a small grocery store. And so they were small business people, and they had no rules, they had no books, they had no idea on what you were supposed to do. And so that's another avenue that I'm kind of interested in.
Cool. What's the time?
25.
Okay, there will be one more my question,
Okay.
And then we use the crowdsourcing. You spoke about the giving back culture in the US. Do you think there is a chance to export this culture? Because I don't know if you've seen some Czech university, but they aren't the coolest, sexiest places to be. How would you persuade the entrepreneurs to think about teaching as the possibility instead of lying at the sea and buying cars and stuff like that?
I don't think anybody's going to persuade. I think you guys went through a period where people were in charge of persuading, and I think that didn't work. And just as an aside, one of the other jokes I make, though probably in Eastern Europe it's probably not as funny, as in business plans we have Appendix A, which is the 5-year plan. The spreadsheet. It dawned on me that no one ever made the connection that the only place that they used to do 5-year plans didn't work out so well. And so I now suggest that perhaps the 5-year plans and business plan probably worked as well as that. That's why we don't do them anymore. But entrepreneurship is
They don't remember it.
Yes, I know, but you're laughing, so so they can show this part to their parents, going, "Oh, I think he made a joke." Entrepreneurship is a calling. It's not a job. It truly. So getting them off the beaches isn't going to happen. I have to tell you, I used to teach this class. It was a joint class between Berkeley and University of California, Berkeley, and Columbia Business School, 2 business schools. And every year I'd have at least one student in that class say, Professor Blank, I need your advice. Well, what is it? Well, I have 2 jobs I'm trying to decide against. Well, what are they? Well, I got this offer from McKinsey. McKinsey is an international consulting firm. It's a very prestigious job. I said, well, that's great. Well, what's your other, option? Well, my roommates are thinking about doing a startup, and I'm thinking maybe I should join them. I said, well, you've already decided. They said, well, don't you want to hear about the startup? I go, no. You've decided. You can't be thinking about a McKinsey job and a startup in the same brain. One is a job. McKinsey is a great job. But entrepreneurship is a calling. The odds of you making money as an entrepreneur, you are better off shoveling garbage on the street and taking that kind of paycheck because you'll probably make more shoveling garbage. Entrepreneurship you do not because you're going to get rich or you're going to become Zuckerberg or whoever or Steve Jobs. You're going to do it because it's something, it's like being an artist. It's like having to paint or sculpt or create music. It's like being a composer. And if that's not how you feel about it, that it's a job, the odds are you're going to fail because entrepreneurship, the closest analogy to me is not engineering, it's not business, it's not marketing, it's art. And it's not just being a painter, or it's being a painter who can't stop painting. Does that help?
Yeah. I'm just asking questions to make you more better.
That's my thought.
So, as I promised, now it's time for you. Please just wait for the camera. And who's got the first one? Jakub.
So, Steve, you talk on your website a lot about the role of government in Silicon Valley and how it, through governmental contracts into, in the 70s, how they actually built up the industrial complex. And obviously that's something that's on a lot of people's mind right now, as there's all these startup accelerators and startup support programs cropping up all around the world. What do you think is the right role of government money inside startup communities?
Yeah, if you really think about, I think you're referring to, on my website, there's something called The Secret History of Silicon Valley. It's also a YouTube video, if anybody hasn't seen it. It's how the CIA and NSA, National Security Agency, accidentally funded a good part of Silicon Valley. But they didn't fund the startups. If you really think about what they did, it was accidentally create the ecosystem by encouraging entrepreneurship spin-outs out of Stanford. And they also created the culture by funding, during the Cold War for us, Lockheed, which was a weapon systems manufacturer, still is. The unintended consequence, though, wasn't that part of the story. It was when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik in October 1957, the U.S. Congress, our Senate and House, panicked and created a set of science agencies to, quote, catch up with the Soviet Union. NASA, ARPA, but one of them, by accident, they created was something called the Small Business Investment Corporation, which matched any investment that somebody would make in a startup 3-to-1. So the government would match venture investments. And that was actually how venture capital got started. So no one has made the connection yet that it was the Soviet Union that started venture capital that actually beat them during the Cold War, building more innovative weapon systems. It's one of those unintended consequences. To answer your question, though, the lessons from Silicon Valley are not whether you need a weapon systems infrastructure, etc. It's what do you extract from that story. Number one, you need or it helps to have an outward-facing university. Number two, a culture of free flow of information. Three is we take for granted in most Western nations and obviously here, utilities 24/7, a legal system that's consistent, a way that financial people can repatriate their investments. And again, I spent time in Moscow and St. Petersburg last year, and the last is not true, which was incredibly surprising because there's a ton of money willing to invest, and the first 3 questions from entrepreneurs in the audience was, how do I get a visa to the United States? And the answer and the reason was kind of interesting. But the other piece, and I keep mentioning it, was not only this pool of entrepreneurs, but this pool of risk capital, pool of investors willing to take risk. And the role of government in the beginning, actually, if you extract the lessons, were they started that by accident, but they started it. And if you read the history of Israeli venture capital, there's a book called Startup Nation, which is probably the best book on how a country engineered the equivalent to Silicon Valley. There are more Israeli companies public on the U.S. Stock Exchange than there are of all of EU companies in technology. And they got it wrong for 30 years, and this was the sum of their experience. And their experience was that they used the government to start incubators and venture firms, and then eventually got the government out of that role. And so my short answer would be, government's role is to start and then plan to get out. Does that help? That would be my advice to any government agency. And that's hard for bureaucracies, because once they start, they tend to perpetuate themselves. And I could tell you this because I am a public official in the state of California as well. It's hard to ever find an agency that says, yes, and we're shutting ourselves down, and when we succeed, they always find some other mission. Did that answer your question?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You have been to Europe quite a few times on these, study travel trips. What has surprised you most over the past few years, let's say? What has disappointed you most? And whether there is any kind of trend or development you can see, with startups, for example, European startups coming to Silicon Valley.
So I gotta tell you, I've been blown away by the democratization of entrepreneurship. And what I mean by that is that we're all now reading the same stuff. Someone said, well, I just read your blog. What? My blog is read where? And I'm not just talking about my blog. I'm talking about the fact that you have equal access to everybody's stuff. And in fact, the biggest problem now with my students, I bet you as well, is it's not whether you have access to information now, it's how do you sort out of all of this advice, which one do I take? Because if you want advice to tell you to do anything, you could find 360 degrees worth of advice. So one is I've been surprised about democratization of entrepreneurship. Two is I've been surprised about how unique Silicon Valley is and how hard it is to start a cluster. Not how hard it is to start, an incubator or entrepreneurship, but the components necessary to have all the pieces. And in lieu of that, until you get that, what's the right strategy for entrepreneurs? Is to start locally and then move your headquarters to, to San Francisco or Silicon Valley, or move it to London, and where's the cash? Do you go to Atlas Ventures or whoever else is funding things in Eastern Europe, and how those pieces work? I haven't seen any government get it particularly right yet. And it's hard. I haven't seen any government get it particularly right yet. And the Finns have a good heart in it. The government agency, and I'm blanking on their name, that does venture capital funding, but they have that problem, which I just told the minister face to face. They need to have an expiration date. And they don't. And so government funding, after a period of time, without the agenda of helping venture firms succeed, actually in the long term makes venture firms not succeed. And so their goal should be to get out of the business, not stay in it. Chile's doing experiments, Finland's doing experiments. Singapore has done it via command and control system in a way that I don't think any other Western society could probably get away with. You have Singapore in one extreme, which is a command control rigid society, and you have Israelis who you can't even agree on what time it is. And so it's that those two extremes are kind of interesting of bookends of how do you create entrepreneurial cultures on a national basis. I forgot what your question was. Did I answer it?
Biggest surprises, biggest disappointments, like pleasant surprises.
Pleasant surprises was groups like this. I just tweeted, I'm in Prague. And okay, now I'm on TV and we're having, and so I kind of enjoy this. I enjoy this because I get smarter every time when I meet. Local groups. I learn something I didn't quite understand, I think if we could figure out what the formula is of not just having these groups, but having having clusters that catch what I call catch fire, that would be just amazing. Though I have to tell you, living in Silicon Valley makes me think historically that there were times in history that there were certain places that were not just the center of the universe, but I mean other places existed at the time. But there was Rome, there was Florence, there was London, there was Paris. Each had its moment. That if you were doing a certain thing, you went to that area. It wasn't that certain thing wasn't occurring elsewhere. Of course it was. But their clusters occur for a reason, is that you have a certain concentration of people and talent that just kind of feeds on itself. And I think we're in that feeding on itself stuff. That is, I don't know if it's uniquely American, but it is uniquely occurring in certainly in Silicon Valley and a little bit in New York City. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. May I have a follow-up question? What is the biggest threat for Silicon Valley you see?
I just wrote about it a couple of weeks ago. And venture capital, even though they take immense risk, tends to invest in herd instincts, like cattle. It's not that there aren't smart VCs, but they tend to follow trends. And that the current trend is social media. Especially, we invested in Instagram. Last year we just made $1 billion. Why should I be investing in life sciences? It takes 10 to 15 years. Why should I be investing in hardware? Boy, that's, Chinese will put me out of business. Why should I invest in clean technology? Chinese are dumping solar cells in the U.S. So all the giant sucking sound you hear is all the money going from one end to another. And startups run on capital. They don't just run on good ideas. And I'm just afraid that a good number of venture firms are actually stopping their investments in other areas that I think are healthy for both our economy and the world. And in fact, it's very interesting. Putting social media aside, I think the most interesting startups in the last 5 years have not been social media ones. They've been SpaceX. Does everybody know who SpaceX is? It's someone named Elon Musk made some money at PayPal and decided, I want to build rockets. And I want to launch, rockets into space. And I want to go to Mars. Stop smoking that stuff. No, I want to do it. Guess what? He just did. He's the first private company to not only launch rockets, his spacecraft just docked with the space station. Puts them up there with the U.S., China, and Russia. No one else, and the EU with the ATV. And then he said, I want to put the car companies out of business, and I'm going to build electric cars. And so he did a company called Tesla. Same guy, hardware. Okay. Another guy, a friend of mine, Sebastian Thrun, decided that wouldn't it be cool if cars could drive themselves? He built the Google autonomous vehicles, which are now being licensed and driven around Nevada and California without anybody driving the cars. And then he just built Google Google Glasses, which are kind of the glasses with a remote screen on them. And I've actually wore a pair, and they're lighter than my glasses, and it really is pretty cool. But we're talking about non-social media and non-whatever. Two guys did some, I think, four of the most interesting hardware companies in the last 5 years. Obviously Apple and iPad, etc. Those are the things that I worry about that you couldn't get funded for today. I don't think you could get a dime for those. And so while we might have great ideas, I just want you to remember it's the capital that will make your great ideas scale, or else you'll still be sitting in your mother's garage. And that's the unique combination of having capital and great ideas. Does that answer? So the disappointment is, and I think eventually we'll run out of the social media phase, and we'll get back into funding kind of things that do stuff, as well as things that solve needs.
May I have an additional question to this? Do you think that Facebook's IPO does affect that approach of VCs to that social networks?
Yeah, I think that VCs were thinking that they were going to be opening champagne, and there was going to be a whole trend of another 50 IPOs right behind them, I thought we were about to start the second bubble, which I happen to think that bubbles are good because it funds the VC cycle. What's very interesting is in Silicon Valley, the investors and the entrepreneurs who make a ton of money don't buy villas in the south of France. We're too stupid. We keep investing back in our own business. No, we do. I mean, like, I keep investing in several. And in fact, most guys I know make a lot of money. They go, "What do we do? I don't know. Let's invest some more." So it's not that we all do that, but the guys who made all that money in the U.S. housing bubble, they're in the south of France, but they're not investing in housing. But technology entrepreneurs and investors tend to, I mean, obviously, once you buy the house or whatever else you're going to buy, tend to kind of give back in their own funny way, because I think it's a symptom of Asperger's, or maybe a slight form of autism. We don't know anything else, so we keep investing back. So yeah, I think Facebook was extreme greed in both Facebook, the investment banker Morgan Stanley, and the fact that we're now in a phase in the U.S. where the Securities and Exchange Commission, the organization that's supposed to manage stock offerings, has basically disappeared for political reasons, etc. It's completely ineffective. If this was the 70s or 80s, they never would have gotten away with this offering and whatever. And so, as far as Facebook was concerned, they won. They took $15 billion out of other people's pockets, took it home, and said, "Thank you very much." What do they care? Everybody else could think it's a disaster. They made $15 billion that they took home and got to spend. Who cares whether the stock went to 25 for a week? And it'll eventually come back up, because I think Facebook fundamentally is one of the first companies that's about to hit the total available market of people on the planet. I mean, if you think about what social media really is for the first time in the history of the world, three things are converging. We are now transferring all basic human needs to be mediated by computer. Sex, communications, gambling, entertainment, all the stuff we used to do face to face is now moving to some platform. But two is, for the first time in the history of the world, almost every human being is going to have a platform that's connecting them 24/7 to other people. Billions of people will have a device 24/7 connected. And then three is, these apps are now reaching a large percentage of those people. Facebook has close to 1 billion people. Wow. I mean, your dog could figure out how to monetize that. And so eventually, someone at Facebook will. And so the issue isn't whether the company is worth anything. The question is when will the reality, the revenue, catch up to its inflated and over the top market cap. Eventually, it's much like the Google's initial price. Eventually, I think for Facebook, they will figure it out, and their revenue will eventually be justify their market cap. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I was.
And that's an opinion.
I was just thinking if you think it will affect maybe what you teach to startups, or if how is it considered, if it was success or not, or how, for example, VCs look at the social networks now?
No, I think VCs still think social networks are great. I think this is a temporary phenomenon, which is a liquidity problem. One bad IPO which shuts down the market for 6 months. In 6 months, people will forget. Some other Twitter or somebody else will go public, and a Twitter IPO, they'll now have to price it 25% cheaper. But it'll still go public. I don't think it doesn't kill social media, because those other trends are inevitable.
Sorry, I know we're over time, but this is bloody awesome. So let's say 2 or 3 more questions, if everybody's okay with that. The first one.
Do I have to say okay?
No.
So I'm Peter. Steve, first of all, I also read your blog. And thank you very much for it. You are personally responsible for several successful projects because of applying your methodology. It was really great. Thank you.
Thank you.
So that's for beginning. And second, I always wanted to ask you. I never knew how. And suddenly, there is the possibility. You have the great D School in Stanford.
Yes.
And those guys, in my opinion, teach very similar stuff as you do. How do you see converging your customer development ideas with design thinking and this stuff, which is basically product development stuff, but whatever a big corporate, it doesn't matter. New product development is always startup. Only with the big company you have more resources, but more bureaucracy on the other hand also.
So it's a great question. How's D-School and Lean and customer development kind of integrate together? And you know, the bad news is I had to answer that question because my wife is now teaching at the D-School. And so at home we had to go, well, what is the difference? And I think we came up with two answers. So where I came from and where I do come from is that startups are driven by not some founder with some theory or, gee, let's do some market survey, but founders that I deal with have an idea, a technology invention or a passion or something else. It's not about some user need. It's about, hey, I got X, let's go, or, you know, look what I could do, or whatever. That is, it's technology or product driven. That's the startup world that I come from. If you look at the D-School, it really is the IDEO world, which says, well, let's, you know, do a survey in the, you know, in the MOP side, and let's go spend time with users and users' needs, and that is, it's user driven, right? And it's not wrong. It's not like one is right or wrong, but they came from very different worlds. The funny analog is the processes kind of converge, but with very different motivations. And I'll give you mine. In the types of startups, again, that I'm working with and that I'm used to, not only is it technology and idea driven, there is a gun to your head, and that gun is the amount of cash you have left. It's very finite. And so the world I come from is that decisions are made now. It's all about speed and tempo and execution and iteration and process, and you know what? There will never be enough facts to get 100% data. Whereas if I'm at Procter & Gamble, I might have 2 or 3 years, and you know what? Project doesn't work, you still have a job, and it's not like any one is good or better, but you make then different trade-offs in the process, right? Where I come from, it's called good enough, or what I've called it is good enough decision making, for example.
But if you take aside the time element,
yeah, but you can't just take beside the time.
Sure,
yeah, it is fundamental to what we do as entrepreneurs. That the time element and being able to act with speed and precision is what drives world-class founders.
Yep.
And in fact, it's what drives very, very smart people crazy, and why a good number of them can't run companies, because the very smartest people need precision in their answer. I need the data. Stupider people like me said, I don't know, let's make a decision, we'll figure it out later. Sorry, no, that's what I would do. And so I had this rule that said there are 2 types of decisions: revocable decisions and irrevocable decisions. Revocable decisions said, you know what, we screwed up, we could fix it later, right? And so therefore, when we had a meeting, revocable decisions got made in that room, or we weren't leaving until we could, come up with a decision. But we're not having another meeting, we're having this meeting. Irrevocable decisions require more time. I'm going to fire these people, or I need to put a 5-year lease on a building that's going to tie up a lot of cash, or I'm going to, hire a bunch of sales people. Those are, if not irrevocable, those are important cash-burning whatever decisions that require thought. The difference between a startup making decisions at this speed, it's not only speed, it's tempo. By the time I've made 10 decisions, some large company, like Procter & Gamble, has basically figured out how to schedule the meeting, right? That's a major decision. But sorry, I don't know if I answered your question.
Because I was heading not more towards this difference between big company and startup, and more between the design thinking, let's say, principles and ideas, and startup
I can't
customer development ideas.
Other than those 2 ideas of where they're coming from, that's the best I could give you. Okay.
Similar question.
Yeah.
Big ocean liners didn't become airlines. Xerox didn't become Apple or Microsoft. eBay is or classifieds didn't become a big eBay. how these big corporations can compete and can keep themselves competitive and reinvent themselves.
So actually, I'm writing you're getting a preview here of a series of blog posts on corporate innovation. Every once in a while, in fact, one of the companies I had helped was General Electric, a big industrial company in the U.S., entered the energy storage business, high-temperature batteries, and we actually helped them do this inside of a large company. It turns out in the 21st century, large corporations are understanding that the life cycle that they had in the 20th century is incredibly compressed. From all the classic things about regulation and industries, regulation and new startups and cultural shifts, but also the globalization of technologies, China Inc., just all these pressures. And so every large company is trying a series of experiments, incubators and venture capital firms and innovation process, etc. Though what's very funny is no one has standardized on what the canonical model for innovation in a large corporation should look like. Osterwalder and I are about to propose one. And the reason why we're about to propose one is in about 1960, Harvard professor named Chandler wrote a book called Strategy and Structure, and it was looking at the evolution of corporate structures for U.S. companies and how did they evolve. And basically, companies used to be organized along functional areas, sales, marketing, engineering, manufacturing. But it was in the 1920s that as corporations got larger, more diverse, they finally started thinking about divisionalization. That you had a general staff, but that you had line execution. And these divisions are basically, so functional organizations or divisionalized corporations are the two models we've now carried for the last almost 100 years. No one has proposed now a different organization that would keep us innovative in the 21st century. And I think what we need to do is rethink strategy and structure for large corporations. I'm going to propose a set of things that large corporations could do to do that, and you'll be reading about them in the next month or so. So the answer is yes. I think corporations have been trying a series of disconnected tactics, all of which are kind of good at heart, but not understanding that structure follows strategy, not the other way around. And they've never quite grasped the strategy part about the differences Clayton Christensen said 15 years ago between sustaining innovation and disruptive innovation. I'll give you an example, by the way. When I was in Finland, I realized I was there for 3 days and no one had mentioned the word Nokia. This is their national champion. What the heck is going on? And they went, well, we're embarrassed. It was like, this is like, your father was caught, like doing something, you didn't want to. It was just like a national shame. And I went, this happens all the time when companies get disrupted. And somebody told me a story, I don't know if it was true or not, that when the first iPhone came out, they had it at the Nokia board meeting. And the Nokia staff said, listen, we have all these projects, we don't have the software as good, but we can make a device that looks like this, and let's go put our resources on this. And someone on the board held it up and said, why should we do that? What's their market share? Wait a minute. Their market share on day one was 0. But the joke is, disruption always looks like a toy on day one. It's a big idea to large corporations that they don't quite understand. That unless disruption and managing disruption is a board-level issue, you are going out of business pretty soon, because somebody will be disrupting you sooner than later. In the 21st century, there's really no place to hide for corporations, or very few. Government monopolies or people who manage to get themselves monopolies like the entertainment business and music and records, etc. If you have enough government people being paid, you could probably do that for another century. But for everybody else, you really have to figure out that, no, next time an iPhone shows up in your boardroom table, stop, you don't laugh. Did I answer your question? Okay. All right.
I'm very sorry, you have more questions, obviously, everybody does. Steve blew our minds, but the camera is dying, so the rest of the questions, please, personally, with Steve, there will be time. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
This was awesome.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.